Previously on Rome, rise and fall of an empire. When the empire is attacked by foreign invaders and a deadly plague, Roman citizens blamed the new religion of Christianity for angering the empire's pagan gods. Desperate, Emperor Decius turns to violence, sacrificing the lives of Christians to win back the gods' favor. Now, threatened by barbarian attacks on all fronts, the people of Rome live in constant fear. As the crisis deepens, insurgents seize control, dividing the empire against itself. Until a new ruler emerges. His name is Aurelian, and he unifies the fractured empire using its greatest reservoir of strength, the army. By the middle of the 3rd century, the Roman Empire is huge and relies on distant, isolated legions to protect every far-flung province.
The troops at this point were forced into a situation where they often had to rely on self-help. The imperial superstructure was very far away from them. Emperors made it to frontier conflicts often after they had mushroomed entirely out of control.
In the absence of the emperor, the soldiers sometimes take leadership matters into their own hands.
The emperor can't be there, so there's a bit of drift, and so somebody arises who is able to do the job for him, and probably will call themselves an emperor in order to rally local support, to beat back the barbarians who are threatening the integrity of the provinces.
Having dared to raise their own emperors, the powerful border armies now declare independence from Rome. As these armies break away on the eastern and western frontiers, forming their own empires, Rome's northern frontier is attacked by the Alemanni barbarians in 269 AD. In his palace in Rome, the true Roman Emperor Claudius II is troubled by this devastating assault on Roman soil.
Enemies from the other side of the Alps did more than invade the Roman Empire. For the first time in an extraordinarily long time, they actually crossed the Alps into Italy.
Claudius seeks the advice of his powerful cavalry commander, Aurelian, a man whose military discipline is described by the 3rd century historian Vopiscus.
Aurelian, from his earliest years, was very quick of mind and famous for his strength. He never let a day go by without practicing the spear, the bow and arrow, and other weaponry.
Aurelian's skills will soon be tested as news from the frontier worsens. Distraught refugees from northern Italy bear witness to the devastation. With this invasion, the danger of a mutiny within the army becomes even greater.
If barbarian people threatened to invade, then the local people would simply proclaim emperor whoever happened to be the military commander in the region at the time.
In order to keep the northern frontier from breaking away as well, Claudius must act quickly to stop the encroaching Alemanni forces. In the Alemanni camp, the barbarians celebrate, reveling in the rich spoils taken easily from a weakened Roman Empire, including Roman women and children they intend to use as slaves.
We've got inscriptions, actually, which talk to us, which tell us about parties of raiders who've gone into Italy and taken lots of prisoners. So it's sort of easy pickings, to some extent, for these raiders. They're preying on an empire that is not at its peak at this time.
The groups of Alemanni are led by powerful chieftains who ensure their warriors' loyalty by rewarding them with slaves of Roman blood. But the barbarians' greed knows no end. Emperor Claudius is forced to march his army from Rome, meeting the Alemanni warriors at Lake Garda in northern Italy. Claudius and his men face a brutal enemy, 4th century historian Ammianus Marcellinus.
Rushing forward with more haste than caution, they threw themselves on our squadrons of horse with horrible grinding of teeth and more than their usual fury. Their hair streamed behind them, and a kind of madness flashed from their eyes.
Emperor Claudius is also severely outnumbered, but he has a secret weapon at his side, the powerful cavalry commander Aurelian.
He was known as manu ad ferrum, that is, sort of hand ready to the sword, ready to leap into action when that should be necessary.
True to his name, Aurelian helps Claudius beat back the Alemanni, killing half their force and driving the rest back over the Alps. And in an effort to better secure Italy from future barbarian attacks, Emperor Claudius and Aurelian traveled to the Balkans to increase the military presence there. But while on campaign, Emperor Claudius contracts the plague.
Claudius's reign was short. He ruled from 268 to 270. He had a signal military success in the year 269, heavily advertised at the time and much talked about later.
But this success, the defeat of the Alemanni, is not enough to restore the empire. As Emperor Claudius's life slips away, it is clear that this task must fall on his trusted general, Aurelian. He is declared emperor by his troops. Aurelian repays them by sacrificing to the god of soldiers, Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, a deity now emerging as the god of victory within the army.
Whatever gives you the victory, whatever it is that's going to be beneficial, that's the wagon, as it were, you hitch your star to.
A man of low birth, Aurelian now rises to the highest position in the empire because of his military brilliance, like many great generals before him.
You can't be a civilian emperor by the middle of the 3rd century. You have to lead troops in battle. There's always some place where you've got to go and fight.
Aurelian will need the loyalty of the soldiers and the strength of their god as he faces a familiar enemy. In 271 AD, the bloodthirsty Alemanni return, ravaging northern Italy and making it as far as Piacenza. Aurelian and his army race west to cut off the barbarians, sending ahead an offer to negotiate. But the Alemanni have other plans.
He invited the barbarians to give themselves up, but reportedly they replied that they were free men and they could show him how free men can fight. Sure enough, at dusk, in the wooded area south of Piacenza, they ambushed the Roman army, which suffered heavy losses.
In the forest, the Roman soldiers are no match for the barbarians.
Why was an ambush such a successful tactics against Roman troops? And largely the answer lies in the form of organization of the Roman armies. They were trained, the discipline consisted in training them to actually fight in a line, in a formation. And evidently you can do so only when the conditions are met where you can develop that formation, which is not the case in a wooded area. Needless to say, the barbarians knew that.
Caught in a wooded trap, the Roman army is thrown into confusion and routed. For Aurelian, the defeat is devastating.
The troops are, in some ways, very loyal to their own commanders, but they're also very fickle. So if an emperor is winning, they are happy to support him. Once an emperor starts to lose, then he's almost certainly done for.
Aurelian rallies what troops have survived, praying that they will remain loyal. He needs them now more than ever to keep the Alemanni from reaching the city of Rome. Terror grips the people of Rome as they fear the barbarians' arrival is imminent. Desperate, many flee the city.
The defeat of the Roman army, or Aurelian's army, created panic in Rome because there was no serious force to stand between the barbarians and the city.
Those unable to escape riot in the streets, enraged by Aurelian's failure to keep the barbarians out of Italy.
The population of Rome does seem to have understood that becoming a vast city in the midst of an empire whose armies were concentrated at the frontier left them, as it were, peculiarly vulnerable if an army were actually to make it into Italy.
But before the Alemanni warriors can reach the capital, Aurelian is finally able to cut them off at Fanum, 180 miles from Rome. After his recent defeat, Aurelian must win back his army's loyalty with nothing less than absolute victory.
Emperors had always relied upon the support of the army. And emperors may have presented themselves as champions of the Republic, but the reality, the underlying reality of imperial power is it always depends upon the army.
Together, Aurelian and his soldiers teach their barbarian foes a lesson in Roman discipline.
They learned now that whenever there was an opportunity for the Roman army to develop in tight formation, they had no chance.
Overwhelmed, many barbarian warriors die a watery death in the Metaurus River. Aurelian's victory drives the Alemanni from Italy at last.
It's also regaining confidence, and no doubt his triumph served to boost morale at a time when it had been greatly shaken.
But Aurelian's hard-won triumph in Italy is quickly overshadowed by news of rising conflict from the city of Palmyra on the empire's eastern frontier. For more than 10 years, beginning well before Aurelian's reign, foreign invaders struck hard against Rome's eastern provinces, including Palmyra, threatening to break through the weakening border.
And this ongoing flow of populations, some of whom were highly militarized and used quite different tactics than the Romans were used to, caused very profound problems in the eastern provinces.
On the edges of the Syrian desert, far from the protection of Rome, the people of Palmyra have faced the devastation of their army alone.
These opponents, they also are taking advantage of the absence of the emperor to take over, to roll back the frontiers, which they do successfully, and to extort payments from the Romans.
Counting the bodies of their dead, the Palmyrines finally grew weary of waiting for help from a distant Rome.
These people in these various areas who are threatened by invasion, they wish they were better protected, so they call upon local defenders to take on the role that the emperors seem unable to do, because the emperors can't be everywhere.
In a blatant act of revolt, the Palmyrene army took matters into its own hands. As a result, for the past decade, the eastern provinces have called themselves the Palmyrene Empire, breaking away from Rome. Now they make a direct threat against Emperor Aurelian by taking the fertile Roman land of Egypt. The rich Egyptian granaries are now controlled by the Palmyrene queen. Her name is Zenobia.
We're fascinated by this figure of a woman of the East wielding such control, perhaps a latter-day Cleopatra type. And incidentally, I mean, she did try to associate herself with Cleopatra. When they took over Egypt, she sought to sort of establish a connection in order to reconcile the Egyptians to her rule.
With Egypt under her thumb, Zenobia basks in her power, ordering the granaries to stop shipments of grain to Rome, cutting off one of the empire's main sources of food.
Italy was, of course, the affective heart of the empire. It was where the empire began. But Africa and Egypt had long been the breadbasket of the empire. That's where the agricultural wealth was concentrated.
Queen Zenobia, with her loyal general Zubdus at her side, now holds the empire's grain hostage, sending a clear message to Rome that the Palmyrenes are powerless no more. Zenobia's power play strikes deep. In Rome, Aurelian finds the people desperate and starving for lack of grain. Though he orders his troops to share their bread with the masses, it is not enough.
Naturally, Egypt was the granary of Rome, and therefore any interruption to the grain supplies to Rome was a huge threat to any emperor, particularly one who had already had strife to deal with in Rome.
The threat of famine leaves Romans restless and angry. Having lost territory to the armies of the East and West, the empire now faces rebellion in Rome itself. Soon the Romans turn against their emperor Aurelian.
The violence, by the way, that these rebellions sparked was on a level not seen since Republican times.
Aurelian has no choice but to unleash his own savage warriors against the insurgents.
You're fighting in Rome itself, you know, and this is civil war. This is something the Romans also fear because they know how divisive it can be and how devastating it could be.
Unaccustomed to battling inside a city, Aurelian soldiers struggle. Though virtually unbeatable on open battlefield, the Roman army once again shows its weakness when tight formation cannot be maintained.
The actual war, the struggle itself, would have been in an urban context. And of course, for the Roman soldiers involved at Aurelian's disposal, this must have been highly unusual. I mean, ancient battles were not typically urban struggles, street by street fighting, and this is where your trained soldiers would have greater difficulty.
But in the end, Aurelian puts down the revolt decisively. The 4th century historian Eutropius.
Aurelian suppressed them with the utmost severity. Several noblemen he condemned to death. He was indeed cruel and bloodthirsty, and rather an emperor necessary for the times than an amiable one.
Aurelian executes the rebel leaders, reminding the people of Rome that he is their ruler. The emperor has crushed the resistance. He now rebuilds the city walls against external forces. Rome will be strong and safe in his hands.
In the aftermath of the military crisis in northern Italy, at the start of his reign, the Emperor Aurelian provided that the city of Rome should be outfitted with a new set of walls. This was the first significant, really significant new set of walls built for the city of Rome since nearly 1,000 years before.
Aurelian now turns to the crisis of the Palmyrene Empire. He must secure his grain supply in order to avoid famine in Rome. His dwindling bread rations will not last forever.
Well, Aurelian was determined to reassert control over all areas of the empire, and so he moves east in 272 to regain control.
His first target is the former Roman city of Antioch, then part of the larger region called Syria. Antioch is a bustling city, invaluable to Rome as a wealthy center of trade. But now, under the control of the Palmyrene Empire, it becomes a safe haven for the fugitive queen Zenobia.
Zenobia and her generals knew for sure that Antioch would be the first city, the first thing Aurelian would have to conquer upon entering Syria. So she barricaded herself in the city, and Zabdas drew the army in the Orontes plain to the west of Lake Antioch.
Zenobia enjoys her prestige, happy to let her generals ready themselves for war just outside the city walls. There, Zenobia's general Zabdas meets Aurelian's army on the battlefield.
You have walls of Romans moving in lines, man to man, fist to fist. You can't kill somebody until you look them in the eye. You've got arms getting cut off, hands getting cut off, damage to the neck, to the face.
But as his infantrymen fall prey to the swords of the Palmyrenes, Aurelian knows his only chance is to outmaneuver General Zabdas.
It is during this battle that Aurelian instructed his highly disciplined light cavalry to perform what later came to be known as the feigned retreat stratagem.
Aurelian's light cavalry pretends to flee, tricking the Palmyrenes into giving chase, leaving the protection of the main lines behind them.
At which point the Roman cavalry turned back and cut them to pieces. In any case, indeed, the Palmyrean cavalry was destroyed and the road was open to Antioch.
General Zabdas orders the surviving Palmyrene troops to retreat. Zenobia and her generals head toward Palmyra. Aurelian gives chase, determined to catch the queen before she reaches her home city. But in the Syrian desert, Aurelian faces unexpected obstacles.
You have to remember this is summer. It's hot in the desert. So harassed by both the hot summer and the Arab nomads that had remained loyal to Zenobia, Aurelian and his army pursued or pushed to Palmyra.
But an arrow wound delays Aurelian's pursuit, giving Zenobia time to secure herself in Palmyra. Cursing his nomad attackers, Aurelian vows to capture their queen. Now ordered to surrender by Aurelian, who has besieged the city, Zenobia writes him a scathing rebuke in the spirit of her model, Cleopatra.
Whatever must be accomplished in matters of war must be done by valor alone. You demand my surrender as though you were not aware that Cleopatra preferred to die a queen rather than remain alive, however high her rank.
Despite her bravado, the proud queen knows she is not safe for long in the city. She quickly packs for travel.
Palmyra itself is not really ready for a siege anyway. They built some very hastily erected defenses, and clearly Aurelian has some support inside the city. It does not hold out for very long.
Queen Zenobia and her general Zubdus slip away into the cover of darkness, eluding Aurelian again. In 272 AD, Zenobia races toward Persia, making it as far as the Euphrates River in modern-day Iraq. But Aurelian's soldiers are in hot pursuit. On the banks of the Euphrates, the queen offers the boatmen gold to cross the river, but even her desperate threats are too late to save her.
She was intercepted and captured by the Roman cavalry. They took Zenobia, her advisors and generals, as prisoners of war and put them on trial.
Bound to prevent escape, Zenobia knows she will soon face Aurelian. Having won back the throne of Palmyra, Aurelian finally confronts the rebel Zenobia, a woman whose boldness he can't help but admire. In his own words,
"What manner of woman she is, how wise in counsels, how steadfast in plans, how firm toward the soldiers, how generous when necessity calls, and how stern when discipline demands."
But facing likely execution, Zenobia's courage begins to wane.
Zenobia pleaded that she had been led astray by bad advice, on which account her advisor was put to death, and so was the general Zabdas.
Aurelian has a different fate in mind for the beautiful queen once they reach Rome. But before leaving Palmyra, Aurelian visits a temple where he will pay tribute to one god alone, the god of soldiers, Sol Invictus, who has ensured his victory on foreign soil.
He clearly had in mind an alliance between him and the sun god that was responsible for his successes in Palmyra. He presented himself on his coins in terms of an association of the emperor to the god, Sol Invictus.
Where we're moving into this dimension of associating the emperor very closely with one particular divinity, who clearly, given the success that Aurelian had enjoyed, people might believe in.
In the peace of the Eastern Temple, he sees that this is the one God to unite all of Rome.
He does seem to have been participating in a growing trend toward universalism, both in religion and in Roman political control.
Offering his own blood as sacrifice, Aurelian promises his God a nation of worshipers. Having taken back the East and restored Rome's ration of free bread, Aurelian is welcomed back to Rome, a hero.
It may have signaled to the Romans an end to what had been nearly a half century of sequence of military catastrophe, followed by recovery, followed by catastrophe, followed by illusory recovery again.
Aurelian has another purpose in Rome. He will use the riches taken from the East to establish the soldier's god, Sol Invictus, as the single deity of the empire. Work soon begins on a new temple.
He actually put the new cult on a par with the official state religion in Rome. He built a magnificent temple for Sol in Rome, which he furnished with the spoils from Palmyra.
But religion must wait for now. Aurelian has more battles to fight before the empire is fully restored. To the north, the Roman territories of Gaul and Britain have fallen under the unlawful rule of a mutinous Roman army that calls their dominion the Gallic Empire. Resembling their barbarian foes more every day, the Gallic soldiers scorn Roman honor, naming the arrogant Roman general Tetricus their emperor.
You have armies popping up all over the place proclaiming their generals emperor, and then they have to fight, and whoever wins is the one who ends up being the legitimate emperor in the end.
The separation of the Gallic Empire was, of course, frightening for Romans. It was a major loss. It was humiliating to have such a significant portion of the traditional Roman Empire in another man's hands.
Emperor Aurelian quickly moves to take back the Gallic lands and restore the empire to its former glory. All that stands in his way is Tetricus and the Gallic army. In 274 AD, the mutinous Gallic Empire encompasses both Gaul and Britain. There, the soldier emperor Tetricus and his army have become indistinguishable from their barbarian enemies. Undisciplined, they revel in the torment of their prisoners.
The job of soldier emperor was tremendously dangerous because they're in power only because they are proclaimed by their troops. But it's a very difficult thing once in power to maintain that, because you have to avoid internal conflicts with other potential generals who see themselves as possible emperors.
Tetricus cannot show any weakness to his troops. But in the privacy of his palace, Tetricus consults his advisors, trying to determine where his next rival will come from.
Tetricus himself had survived over the previous several years a number of internal disputes, some actually leading to considerable bloodshed among rival leaders in the Gauls.
He plans to someday leave his kingdom to his son, establishing a dynasty in his own name. But reports of a new challenger now threaten to destroy this dream.
It seems to have been clear to him that in the aftermath of his success in the East, Aurelian was going to and was already marching on Gaul in an attempt to reintegrate Gaul into the Roman Empire.
With news of Aurelian's approach, the volatile Tetricus blames his advisors, lashing out at everyone around him. In 274 AD, Aurelian marches to Chalons, Gaul, in modern-day France, to face Tetricus and win back the western territories for Rome. Aurelian and his men meet Tetricus in the forests of Chalons, where the fighting is fierce.
Aurelian's army probably contained more cavalry than traditional imperial armies had up until now. As for Tetricus's army, well, there were still important legions along the Rhine guarding these areas. It would have been a battle between forces, much similar forces with similar equipment at their disposal, and therefore all the bloodier and more devastating for the armies involved.
It is Tetricus's army that now bears the brunt of Aurelian's vengeance. Having dared to name another as their emperor, it is they who remain the greatest threat.
Part of the crisis of the 3rd century is the importance that the army plays in choosing an emperor. This is something that's relatively new in the Roman world, and it's a result of constant warfare. The army becomes more powerful, it becomes more able to choose emperors, and it becomes more able to impose its own choice of emperors on Rome itself.
Aurelian cannot allow this affront to his power. As Tetricus's army falters, Aurelian orders his troops to cut them down, showing no mercy.
Some sources claim that Tetricus realized the game was up even before the battle, but it looks as though he did fight it out to the end, and it was, in the end, Aurelian who gained the victory.
It is the culmination of his efforts to reunite the empire. In the end, he takes the usurper Tetricus prisoner. And as with Queen Zenobia of Palmyra, Emperor Aurelian spares Tetricus's life.
And for Tetricus too, it was surprising that, particularly an opponent in civil war, opponents in civil wars were usually represented a great danger. They might, after all, turn against you later. So Aurelian displayed remarkable clemency in sparing the lives of both of these opponents.
Tetricus's Gallic army is not so lucky. For it is they who have raised a rival emperor in the West, and now they will pay the ultimate price for their treason.
Aurelian was a great disciplinarian, it seems. He tolerated no mutinies on the part of soldiers. He drove them hard, but was respected by them.
To maintain his own soldiers' respect, Aurelian knows his punishment of the captured Gallic soldiers must be brutal and complete. Not one is spared.
Aurelian was both a successful military commander and in some respects, as perhaps one had to be, a fairly savage one. And yet, his treatment of Tetricus was remarkably generous.
It is in this generous spirit that Aurelian returns victorious to Rome. There, after 4 years of non-stop campaigning, Aurelian celebrates his reunification of the empire with a spectacular triumph parade, displaying high-ranking captives from every far-off conquest.
There's all sorts of other lore that goes with this ceremony, which mark it out as distinct and in some way both as barbaric and awesome. The presence of the emperor Aurelian in Rome and the presence of the emperor in order to celebrate an actual military victory was a novel event for its entire generation.
The defeated usurpers Zenobia and Tetricus are paraded as well, evidence of Aurelian's successes in the East and West.
It was a humiliating spectacle to be paraded through Rome as a captured enemy leader. It implied, as it were, that probably you lacked the courage to have died in battle.
Humiliated though they may be, Zenobia and Tetricus and the other captives are allowed to live by the generous Emperor Aurelian. He also shows his generosity to the people of Rome.
Aurelian himself distributed largely the bread, the pork meat, but also, we are told, white tunics of Egyptian and African cloth. So it was clearly a very generous display of force there.
Grateful in his triumph, Aurelian consecrates the temple he has built for the god of soldiers, Sol Invictus, whose power and favor he believes have made him invincible.
Many scholars believe simply that this was trying to enforce conformity among the peoples of the empire for political purposes and also for religious purposes, and those two things are not that easily separated in the mind of a Roman.
Aurelian decrees this day, December 25th, will be celebrated each year as the birthday of Sol Invictus. Later emperors, also seeking to unite Rome with religion, will adopt this date for the birth of Jesus Christ. Even now, over 1,700 years later, this once pagan holiday is celebrated as Christmas around the world.
throughout the empire in the 3rd century, there's clearly a movement towards monotheism, towards different cults that believe in a single god, and sometimes in a single redeeming god.
The United Roman Empire now stretches from Palmyra to Britain. But in 275 AD, barbarians again wreak havoc in the east. Aurelian marches his army to Thrace to prepare for battle.
Aurelian is a fascinating figure. He was a very energetic and dynamic individual. If you think of all the places in which he campaigned in his life, he must have had tremendous energy.
It is this drive and energy that earn him the loyalty of his troops.
Aurelian is very successful as a military leader. He knows his troops. He works very effectively with them. I'm sure he rewards them on a regular basis. He can, I think, depend on a significant ongoing support from the soldiers. They trust him. They see him as their leader.
Having brought these soldiers the glory and honor of unimaginable victory, Aurelian never suspects the betrayal that festers among their ranks.
The assassination of Aurelian is again one of these things that's very difficult to explain, particularly at a time when he's been so successful militarily, when the troops should feel satisfied with that success and with their rewards.
Their treacherous act leaves the empire in shock.
As far as we know, the news that the emperor was dead were received with disbelief. And a lot of sadness. He was buried with great pomp in a magnificent tomb at the very spot where he was assassinated.
Rome mourns the loss of a great emperor, one who has saved the empire from certain collapse.
I think Aurelian's importance lies in the fact that it's the beginning of the Roman recovery, of the, as it were, the central Roman machine coming back to life, and he managed to reunite the empire, to bring it all under his central control.
But in the end, not even the god of soldiers could protect him from the swords of traitors. And the empire he had worked so hard to unite fragments again. Next on Rome, rise and fall of an empire. Inheriting an empire ravaged by barbarians and torn apart by rival emperors, one man will emerge victorious. His name is Constantine. Fighting under the banner of a new god, he brings unity to a divided Roman Empire.
Egypt was one of the earliest of the great civilizations which arose independently on Earth 5,000 years ago. The monuments the ancient Egyptians left behind, like this, the Great Pyramid of Khufu at Giza, are still among the most impressive and the most long-lasting creations of humanity. In the pyramid are enshrined some of the central concerns of their culture, concerns shared by all civilizations, even by the modern West. But no civilization held them for longer or more tenaciously than the ancient Egyptians.
Over the last 20 years, we in the Western world have become painfully aware of how our well-being is inextricably bound up with that of nature. And that understanding has given us a fresh insight into the psychology of Egyptian civilization, their attitude to religious cult, to rulership, to the afterlife, and to the idea of the unchanging stability of the cosmos. And what more dramatic illustration can there be in the whole world than the Great Pyramid, and this room in particular, of the human yearning for immutability, for the human concern for life after death. And the fact that this place has the power to move us so much after so many millennia, whatever culture we come from, is a testimony surely not only to its grandeur of conception and execution, marvelous as that is, but also to the fact that we still share the impulse which lies behind it. And in that sense, we of the late 20th century, for all our modernity, are still Bronze Age people.
Since ancient times, the Egyptians have experienced so many changes, above all in the triumph of Islam, that they might appear now to be cut off forever from the age of the pharaohs. But perhaps there is a deeper sense in which a society's ideals are passed on, a habit of civilization. Do you really believe, wrote the novelist Tawfiq al-Hakim, that the thousands of years that make up Egypt's past could have vanished without trace, as if in a dream? The Nile, said the great Arab traveller Ibn Battuta, surpasses all the rivers of the world in sweetness of taste, in length of course and utility. The civilization of Egypt, like those of Iraq, India and China, drew its life from a river. But this was a country like no other. Running for 600 miles between dunes and cliffs, a narrow ribbon of blue water and green fields, on average only 6 miles wide. This geography shaped the civilization. Where the spirit of Iraq was pessimistic, here when the Nile flooded each year, as the ancients said, the fields laugh, men's faces light up, and God rejoices in his heart. From the life-renewing soil left by the inundation, the Egyptians drew a cheerful confidence in humanity, in the permanence and stability of things. Theirs was an optimistic civilization. Their civilization grew out of a long prehistory of culture in the Nile Valley. The coming together of many small egalitarian farming communities. Communities sustained as today by a hard-working peasantry, tilling the soil, creating an elaborate filigree of ditches and dikes to capture the annual flood. The Aswan High Dam, built in 1970, may have changed this age-old rhythm, but today's Egypt still depends on the tillers, the fellahin, and what the ancients called the Black Earth. Not long before 3000 BC, these local cultures were unified into a single state, the first in history. And here at the very beginning, there are clues which will determine the shape of Egyptian civilization, right down to the Islamic period. Our search begins in an obscure little village in Upper Egypt called Qom el Ahmar, the Red Mound. This was the center of a prehistoric tribal kingdom, shrine of a local divinity called Horus, the hawk. Hence its Greek name, Hierakonpolis, Hawk Town.
This is the old kingdom town.
In 1897, two British archaeologists, Quibell and Green, came here looking for the origins of Egypt.
About 20 years ago, the Americans came back to the same place.
In a field beyond the village, they made a stunning discovery, a heap of ceremonial pallets and mace heads from the ritual stores of Egypt's first kings. Kings called cobra, catfish, scorpion, hawk.
So the old kingdom temple is this whole area here, the Temple of Horus.
Yeah.
Is that right? Didn't Egypt begin here? The first kings, I think.
Very old area.
Did any of their fathers work on those excavations?
Yes.
Among the finds was perhaps the most significant object ever dug up in Egypt. A slab of black slate 2 feet long, cut with scenes commemorating the deeds of a king called Narmer, whom legend said was the unifier of Egypt. Here is the very moment of Narmer's triumph. Wearing the crown of Upper Egypt, he dashes out the brains of the captive king of the Delta. Headless enemies lie in rows before the standards of Horus the Hawk. And already a superhuman aura surrounds the king himself, an aura of divinity.
90 years on, it's very difficult to see any trace of those momentous discoveries here in the area where the pallets and the mace heads were found. But a year later, Green made an equally intriguing find in the same area. He came across the remains of a large circular mound of clean white sand about 50 yards across and 8 feet high, enclosed by a sloping sandstone revetment. There was evidence of a walkway leading to some central feature. Green thought the dating was prehistoric, before the first kings of dynastic Egypt, and he interpreted the mound as being a symbolic representation of the mound of creation itself, the first island which had risen out of the seas of chaos at the beginning of time, and on which the first life had landed, the hawk. The divine kingship of Horus would last as long as ancient Egypt itself.
Here in the great temple at Edfu, that same creation myth would be expounded in loving detail for colonial Greek overlords, nearly 3 millennia after Nama's day. It was at the heart of the Egyptian conception of civilization. Every Egyptian temple, then, was a symbolic representation of that original mound of creation with that simple reed shrine surrounding the perch on which the hawk had landed, which was created at Hierakonpolis. And no matter how big the temples became in later ages, the Holy of Holies was still that simple reed shrine, depicted here at Edfu 3,000 years later. You can make out the line of reeds surrounding the chamber in which the image of the hawk was kept. The temple was not only, though, a depiction of the first place, but of the first time, the time when the pattern of a stable society was handed down to humankind, of kingship, law, religion, and ritual, a pattern which it was believed would suffice for eternity as long as the rituals were correctly performed. The universe then and civil society were conceived of as static. Progress, change, new questions, new answers were not required because they were not needed. And indeed, they wouldn't be needed until Alexander the Great conquered Egypt 3 millennia later. For the Egyptians, then, divine kingship was the guarantee of a stable cosmos. The same idea can be traced across the world, from Shang, China to Aztec, Mexico. And here at Abydos, those first kings of Egypt were buried with immense brick mortuary temples, like earthly palaces. And so the key themes of Egyptian history were laid down. Centralized power, royal rituals, and the cult of the dead intertwined to form the ideology of the world's first state. Themes still potent, even in our own day. Moving northwards along the Nile, the narrow valley meets the green expanse of the delta. At this strategic point, close by today's capital, Cairo, the Horus kings built their royal city, Memphis. On the sandstone escarpment above the floodplain is the great funeral complex of the Third Dynasty kings. Here at Saqqara, the mud brick architecture of Abydos was turned into stone. An immense 200-foot-high tomb of King Jose, the first of the pyramids. In a handful of generations around 2500 BC, a series of gifted kings, Huni, Senefru, Khufu, Khafre, building bigger and bigger as each seems to try to outdo his predecessor, created the greatest series of funeral monuments the world has ever seen. The most famous, the Giza pyramids, are now all but engulfed by the suburbs of Cairo, stripped of their polished limestone casing and plundered for building stone, but still awesome. There are many myths surrounding the building of the pyramids. The Hollywood epic version had slave gangs whipped along by tyrannical masters. But Egypt was not a slave society. The mass of the workforce was not enslaved. In a long reign, it was perfectly possible for a government to mobilize huge-scale state employment to build such monuments, using the workforce in the wet season, when the Nile flood left idle hands.
From the graffiti in the quarries, we can get some idea of the character of the gangs who built these pyramids. The tough gang, the boys who stay forever, Khufu's boys. But exactly how it was done, there's very little evidence for. They must have worked from an enormous ramp running from the river, with feeder supports of wood and earth, perhaps, to bring the stones round. The Greek traveller Herodotus, who came here in the 450s BC, said that he was told by tour guides that it took 20 years with gangs of 100,000 men to do it.
The ancient Greeks, with typical cockiness, called them pyramids after the triangular cakes they knew back home. We can see them now in the light of the artificial mountains built by other cultures, Babylonians, Maya and Aztec. For all civilizations have sought validation for their power over the masses by creating great public symbols. But more than that, the dead king is now a manifestation of the sun god himself.
When the construction job was finished, the pyramids were covered with a case of fine Tura limestone. And although most of that has disappeared over the centuries, you can see over there on Khephrem's pyramid, the top coating is still there. That's what they looked like. But what were they for? They were tombs, but what did the shape mean? Well, the pyramid clearly was what it seems to be, a staircase on which the king's spirit could ascend to heaven and then go back to his tomb. And what we're looking at over here is an image of the rays of the sun god coming down to earth. A typical piece of the Egyptian imagination in which an immaterial concept is represented in such a material form. And on winter's days here in Giza, you can actually sit here and watch the sun breaking through the clouds and falling down at the same angle as the pyramids. A stairway to heaven then, the rays of the sun on which the king, nimble and wise, could ascend to the indestructible stars.
The Egyptians created the world's first unified state. In modern terms, it was a provider state, providing a basic standard of living to all its people through control of irrigation, in return for enormous surpluses to be spent on tombs, temples and palaces. Through these great buildings, it expressed its ideologies of power, its belief in the indivisibility of divine and earthly rule, in the need for a stable cosmos. Such ideas may have been essential needs of civilization at the start. And yet even today, almost all of us still live in nation-states with some or all of those same characteristics. Our thinking is still shaped by their religious and social myths, and especially by the myth of the great ruler, king or god. For it was in his name in the Bronze Age that the many surrendered power to the few, to live in the condition in which most of the people of the planet still live today.
Worship of the great ruler was perhaps a necessary stage in the development of civilization. But even now, in the TV age, kings and presidents and popes use the vast array of visual aids invented here and which we see all around us to boost their authority. And do we not still engage in ruler worship ourselves whenever we cheer a presidential motorcade as it sweeps by, or celebrate the jubilee of the Queen of England as she passes escorted by beefeaters in 16th century costume, or watch musketeers give an antiquated salute on the White House lawn?
Perhaps then we are only just emerging from the spell of the Bronze Age revolution which created civilization and shaped our ways of thinking. In the long term in history, we are perhaps still too close to them to see ourselves as we really are. In ancient Egypt, the ties binding people to the state were not only economic, but religious. And the great event in its religious life was the pilgrimage to Abydos. Each year, thousands of people set out for the little town in Middle Egypt to celebrate the resurrection of Osiris, king of the dead. The pilgrimage provided a focus for the feelings of ordinary Egyptians, and rather like Hindus today at Benares or Shia Muslims at Kerbala, many asked to be brought to Abydos for burial. And at Abydos, we find another of Egypt's great legacies to the world. It's still a haunting place, cradled in an immense curve of the western cliffs, the realm of the dead. A holy place since prehistory. In the ruins of the sacred city, the Temple of Seti I, built in 1300 BC, still survives. It's one of the peaks of ancient art. Moving from daylight into its darkened inner sanctum, the visitor has an uncanny intimation of a still active residue of spiritual power. Long before the Christians and Muslims, even ordinary Egyptians came to believe in an eternal soul, in a last judgment, and in resurrection after death. These great conceptions were acted out in a public passion play at Abydos, and are depicted on the temple walls here as a rite of passage for King Seti himself. Here too are many motifs familiar to Christians, especially the role of the Divine Mother, Isis.
Here Isis is caressing Seti on her knee, and she says to him, "You're my son, come out of me. I have nourished you that you may be lord of the two lands. I have made your body strong in victory against all the enemies who may come against you. Your Majesty is King of eternity, a falcon abiding forever." And here's Isis giving the breath of life to Seti, and above her, her words are, "You have made your mansion, your temple, to magnify our nature and adorned it with all kinds of excellent stonework. And your reward for this will be the lifespan of the sky, or as long as Abydos shall exist."
At first sight, these gestures and actions may seem rather archaic and bizarre. But if you just step back a little and think, for example, what a Muslim or a Buddhist or even a Protestant would make of seeing for the first time a solemn Roman Catholic Mass, then a lot of those tender gestures, which are so familiar to Christians, would lose their meaning. In all religions in the world,
simple and often strange gestures can carry profound truths. And it was just the same in Egyptian religion, which certainly did not lack ethical content. But the key to understanding the function of this great building lies in these little chapels just at the end of this room. In this inner shrine is the climax to the whole ritual. It's concerned with the installation of King Seti, not only as Osiris's heir as a living king, but with his union with Osiris after death. And here, Isis and Horus perform rituals for him, and Seti is now dead and deified. Here he's represented as a mummy in a white wrap. And over there on the far wall, blackened by smoke and age, Seti, restored to the colours of living flesh and blood, comes into the presence of Osiris, where he will become one, resurrected himself, with the resurrected King of the Dead.
So the simple and strange gestures reveal a simple yet profound message. A belief in righteousness on earth, in the Last Judgment, in eternal life, though not in damnation, which had no place in the Egyptians' optimistic view of things. But these ideas would play a key role in the later development of Christianity and of Islam. Out in the desert at Abydos, millions of broken pots still lie where the ancient pilgrims left them as offerings to their god. For them, the wind roaring down the great gorge in the western cliffs was the sound of the spirits of the dead, whose annual pilgrimage to Osiris, they believed, would continue as long as Abydos exists. In 332 BC, Egypt was conquered by Alexander the Great. And then Egyptian civilization turned away from its immemorial roots towards the sea and a wider world. On the Mediterranean coast, a new capital was founded, which became the meeting place of Europe and Asia on the shore of Africa, Alexandria. The greatest market in the inhabited world, wrote the Roman Strabo. Beacon to traders from all nations who came by land and sea, bearing spices from South India and the treasures of the Silk Route to China. It's paradise here, said the poet Herodas. You can get anything you want. Money, shows, games, women, wine, boys, the best library in the world. In short, all earthly delights. Like 20s New York, Hellenistic Alexandria was a land of opportunities whose streets were paved with gold. It drew immigrants of all kinds. Bankers, clerks, engineers, poets, even religious dropouts. These extraordinary mummy portraits allow us literally to look into the eyes of such people. Even we feel to sense their hopes and fears. Vain and violent, rich and prosperous, it was said, they've only one god here, Mammon. Our good life in Alexandria was brief, wrote the poet Cavafi. But how potent were the perfumes, how splendid the bed on which we lay, and to what sensual delight we gave our bodies. Down here in the catacombs of Alexandria, you can still enter that weird and wonderful world where Egyptian and Greek and Jewish and Oriental religion and magic met and intermingled. The Greeks who came here to Egypt were very open-minded about the local gods. The deep experience of Mediterranean paganism made it easy for them to identify Amun with Zeus, or to say the Egyptians worshipped Aphrodite, the goddess of love, but they called her Hathor. And how that worked in practice, you can see in this astonishing tomb deep below the streets of Alexandria. At first sight, it looks like a typically Egyptian tomb with papyrus columns and the winged disk of the sun behind and the row of cobras' heads. But when you look closer, you notice human figures in ancient Egyptian poses but with Greco-Roman faces. On each side of the door, guardian serpents, but carrying the snake-entwined staff of Hermes, the Greek guide of souls, and above them, Medusa's heads. And when you go inside the tomb itself, you can see that the sarcophagi are decorated with traditional Greek motifs, bunches of grapes, wreaths, cattle skulls and masks. But above them are the ancient gods of Egypt. There's Isis protecting the sacred bull with her wings, and over here Thoth, the god of wisdom, the falcon-headed Horus tending to the mummy of the dead, and here even the jackal-headed Anubis, the guardian of the dead, wearing Greco-Roman military gear. This then is the strange synthesis that emerged in Greek Egypt. It was said that Alexander had hoped to create a new world order based on his multiracial ideal of brotherhood among nations. But with hindsight, ironically, we can see that his Hellenistic empire actually laid the cultural foundations of Islam. When he died in Babylon, aged 32, Alexander's body was brought back for burial in a lavish tomb in Alexandria. It's never been found, but the clues point to this tiny mosque in the heart of the old city.
An Arab traveller who came here in the 9th century AD described this place as the Mosque of the Two-Horned Prophet, a strange echo of the ram's horn helmet with which the Egyptian priests of Amun had crowned Alexander the Great. And through the Middle Ages, it was revered not only as the tomb of the prophet Daniel, which is still down there, but also as the tomb of the king and prophet Iskander, Alexander the Great himself.
The tunnels and cellars that fan out from underneath this mosque have never been explored properly. But that's not really surprising. The city's absolutely honeycombed with them, and they're really dangerous. There's a great Alexandrian story of the fat bride who, on her wedding procession, fell through a hole in the street and disappeared, and despite the best efforts of the guests, she was never seen again.
In 1850, a servant at the Russian consulate came down here and got lost in the corridors. When he came out, he said that he'd seen in a gap in the stonework a chamber with a glass coffin and a human body with a gold diadem round its head and fragments of papyrus everywhere.
That description closely matches the last classical witnesses of the tomb of Alexander the Great, but suspiciously so. He was probably lying. Nevertheless, it's an intriguing thought that the solution to the greatest mystery in the history of Alexandria could lie somewhere behind one of these blocked-up corridors.
It's 3 a.m. in the remote monastery of St. Paul, near the Red Sea. The monks begin their devotions before dawn. These are Christian Copts. Their name means Egyptians, and their language and music contain survivals from pharaonic times. Their culture goes back to the early centuries AD, when Egypt became part of a Christian Roman Empire. And even today, they represent nearly 10% of Egypt's population. This church was founded in the 3rd century AD by St. Paul the Anchorite. And with the Christians, we come to the second great foreign transformation of the native culture of the Nile Valley.
In late Roman Egypt, an upheaval began as momentous as any political revolution. A change in the psyche of Near Eastern culture, which has helped shape the Western mind ever since. A vision of life which believed in withdrawal from the world. Monasticism. At this time, the blue water and emerald fields of the Nile Valley were exchanged for the inhospitable desert. There are strange parallels with our own time, in the widespread feeling that civilization itself had failed. Better cities may arise one day, said the Egyptian philosopher Plotinus. Our children, though conceived in a sinful age, may build better than their fathers. And so the old fabric of pagan culture, the stable cosmos which had sustained Egyptians for so long, was eroded by Christianity, with its appeal not to a great earthly ruler, but to a distant high God.
This was a time, said one, when we realized how insecure the human condition is. These fateful changes were mirrored in the way people saw the world. For nearly 1,000 years, classical Mediterranean art had glorified the physical world in the belief that mankind, as the Greeks said, was the measure of all things. Now artists retreat into a crude language of symbols. To us, in the age of Freud and Jung, it looks like a failure of nerve, a loss of faith in the material world, perhaps even deeper psychic trauma. Everything has gone, said Cyprian. Honesty, friendship, skill in the arts, standards in morals. This vast and wonderful world is heading for destruction. And so, with St. Paul of Egypt, the stage was set for fundamentalists of all persuasions to fight over the legacy of the ancients.
Bishop Anachorites, chief of the Anchorites, born in the city of Alexandria, AD 228, died AD 343.
A revolution of the mind was now in process. And out of this crisis, a new religion would emerge as the dominant culture of the whole region. In 641, Egypt was conquered by Muslim Arabs bearing a new gospel, that of the Prophet Muhammad. And here in Edfu, the town of Horus, ordinary Egyptian people in their mud brick slums around the temple soon began to abandon the uncertainties of the past for the certainties of a single God, Islam.
And so, here in Edfu, in Upper Egypt, as throughout the Mediterranean and Near Eastern worlds, the Christians and the Muslims were the inheritors of the ancients. And their belief in a single God, which the muezzins are chanting now from their minarets, developed out of a tendency long apparent in the ancient world. For the Catholic papacy, the Muslim caliphate, the Orthodox churches of the Greeks and Syrians and Copts all stem from the attempt of men to rule their fellow men and women under a distant, high and all-powerful God. And the effects of that tremendous revolution at the end of the late antique world still shape our lives today. The last Greek religious papyrus from 7th century Egypt sets the seal on that revolution. For it gives in Greek the very words we can hear around us now. In the name of God, the merciful and the compassionate, there is one God and one God alone. And it goes on in Greek, Mahmed apostolos Diou. Muhammad is the apostle of God. With that, to all intents and purposes, the world of the ancient Egyptians had passed.
The change to Islam would take many centuries. And out in the countryside, especially in Upper Egypt, the deeper layers of the past are still visible today. It's the eve of the full moon in mid-March, heralding the onset of the heat of summer. And at this time, tens of thousands of people come in from the countryside to descend on the little town of Luxor for a great annual festival. Up here, people still celebrate the ancient feast days, the spring festival, the rising of the Nile, and especially the 40 days of mourning for the dead. But this is the biggest. It's a Muslim festival for an Islamic saint, but it takes place at a mosque inside one of the great pagan temples of ancient Egypt. The Coptic Christians take part too, for they also once had a church inside the temple. The saint himself, Abu Haggag, died in the 11th century, at the point when Islam was becoming the majority religion here. His tomb inside the mosque has been a place of pilgrimage ever since. As everywhere, orthodoxy may demand one thing, but what the people do is another matter. And in the worship of sheikhs and saints, the ordinary people, the fellahin, fill the void between their daily hopes and fears and that distant high God. The night is passed in passionate celebration with the traditional music and songs of Upper Egypt. The two lands may have been united 5,000 years ago, but the south is still a distinct country, and tonight a man from the Delta would be a complete stranger here. Next day, the festival reaches its climax. The living descendants of the saint lead a huge procession around the ancient temple and its mosque, bearing representations of the coffins of Hagag and his sons. Bringing up the procession are Luxor's guild of ferrymen bearing boats. They're on trucks these days, but nonetheless the ferrymen are discharging their traditional duty, just as their ancestors did thousands of years ago, when around the streets of ancient Luxor they bore the boat of the sun god Amun. The day ends not in solemnity, but in carnival and license. The ancient legacy also survived in the city. Cairo, the mother of cities, as Ibn Battuta said. Its numberless buildings peerless in their beauty and splendor. The meeting place of travelers, shelter of the strong and weak, whose throngs of people surge like the sea. Founded in sight of the ancient capital Memphis and the pyramids of Giza and Saqqara, Cairo has long been the cultural capital of Arab Islam. And here too, even today, in its mosques and universities, we can still find a living link with the world of the pharaohs. A civilization conservative in character, like its ancient predecessor. Here in the Al-Azhar, the leading teaching mosque of Islam, older than Oxford or the Sorbonne, learning is still the study of the sacred texts, binding the land together as it did in ancient Egypt. In city and countryside, then, the modern Egyptians still do some of the things their ancestors did, for all the apparently cataclysmic breaks in their history. Now here in Cairo in the late 14th century, those questions were examined by the greatest of all Islamic historians, Ibn Khaldun. His concerns were the same as ours in these films, the nature of civilization, its rise and decline. He considered that settled, cooperative human life was the goal of civilization, that it went in cycles of growth and decay like all forms of life. He thought, incidentally, that overconsumption in society was an inevitable cause of decline, but that under certain favourable conditions of geography and climate and the character and customs of the people, culture could acquire a rootedness that he called the habit of civilization. And in all history, Egypt was perhaps the best example of that habit. The pharaohs, he points out, had political power for 3,000 years. They were followed by the Greeks and the Romans, and then the legacy taken on by Islam. So the habit of civilization was continuous here. Nowhere else in the world was it more firmly rooted. And that perhaps explains Egypt's continuing cultural leadership in the Islamic world today. At the beginning lay the early Egyptian state, the first comprehensive attempt in human history to satisfy the needs of men and women to live together in an ordered state with a degree of happiness and material well-being. And so far, it's been one of the most successful. And so, even after the triumph of Islam, the legacy of the pharaohs did not give up all its numinous power. And it has not yet.